Good morning. I got that going. Mhm. Good morning. Let's begin class here. So last week we started a new topic that we're going to continue on. One of the ways that we know that the Gospels appear to be eyewitness accounts. And we looked last week at what's one of the hallmarks of an eyewitness account. And we mentioned that police have experience at this. Police are experienced at interviewing multiple eyewitnesses to some incident. And reliable accounts of multiple eyewitnesses will be compatible. They won't be contradictory, but they won't be identical. And if they were word for word identical, the police would be suspicious that these people got together on their story and just copied each other. And that wouldn't make two testimonies. That would make one if they were identical, basically. So we started to look at the Gospels as eyewitness accounts. And one question is, what does it mean for each Gospel if it looks like an eyewitness account? And the answer is different for different Gospels. Because if Matthew and John look like eyewitness accounts, that just means that Matthew and John were eyewitnesses and they did a reliable job of recording what they saw. But if the Gospel of Mark looks like an eyewitness account, there's a little bit of indirectness because we believe that Mark was recording the gospel preaching of Peter in Rome. So if the Gospel of Mark looks like an eyewitness account, then that would mean two things. It would mean that Peter did a good job of preaching what he saw. It would also mean that Mark did an accurate job of recording what Peter was preaching, so that as you go through two stages, Peter's recollection, Mark's recording, you still end up with a reliable eyewitness account. Now for Luke, we have a different picture, right? Because we know that Luke went out and interviewed eyewitnesses. So for Luke, genuine eyewitness flavor to the gospel means he did a good, accurate job of interviewing eyewitnesses and maybe even discerning which eyewitnesses to record and which ones not to. Which ones sounded reliable and which ones did not. Perhaps. And of course with, for example, Matthew, there's a little bit of interviewing there too, right? Because there's a birth story in Matthew. We believe that Luke got his birth story from Mary. A similar source, probably Mary, would have to be there for Matthew. He wasn't an eyewitness to the birth. Last week we looked at one particular type of evidence that you're dealing with an eyewitness account. It's called undesigned coincidences. Different eyewitnesses will give different details. That's just the way people's memory works. Two different eyewitnesses to an event will record that event or recite that event with different details. And since each of them doesn't necessarily have all the details, when you're reading one eyewitness account, a certain question might come to your mind because they left something out. But then when you read another eyewitness account, that question might be answered by the details that second eyewitness remembered. And this is not a deliberate, designed attempt for the second eyewitness to cooperate with the first eyewitness. This is just the way it turns out when different eyewitnesses remember different details. If they designed, if the second eyewitness were designing harmony with the first eyewitness, it would be very striking. But when it's not designed, it's very subtle. And all of the examples we look at are fairly subtle here. Last week we looked at examples where when you're reading the Gospel of John, if you only have John, you might stop and say, wait a minute, I have a question about this. Now this is hard for us because we've read all four Gospels, and they're all jumbled up in our minds together. But if you only had John, you might come up with a certain question, and then the answer would only be found in the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke being written before John, they were obviously not designing to answer questions that you might have from reading John. It's just the way it turned out. We're going to look at the reverse today. What happens when you're reading Matthew, Mark, or Luke? Does it ever not completely answer all your questions without going to a detail that's in the Gospel of John? Before the feeding of the 5,000, which is recorded in all four Gospels, in Mark, for example, it says the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. Now this is a very subtle thing, but in the Gospels we see lots of examples, right, of Jesus performs a miracle and people start flocking around Jesus to where he can, hardly get any time to pray even or something, because they want to see another miracle or whatever. Of course, this very miracle here that hasn't happened yet, the feeding of the 5,000, is one example that causes people to come pursue Jesus because they want more free food, for which Jesus rebukes them in John chapter 6. But this says something a little different. It says people were coming and going. That's not the phrase you would use of they're all coming after Jesus. That's a phrase that just kind of indicates they're in some high traffic area. They're in the middle of these crowds coming and going, and Jesus says, let's get out of here. Let's get out of this crowd. Let's go off to a more rural place, which is where the feeding of the 5,000. So the question might be, why coming and going? Not just people flocking to Jesus, but just people coming and going. Why are they in the middle of a bunch of people coming and going? And in John, there's a detail about the feeding of the 5,000 that you don't have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It took place, the Passover was almost there. Now, what happens when the Passover is near? When the Passover is a few days away, you get a mass pilgrimage from Galilee and farther north down to Jerusalem. And so if you're out there on one of the main roads, one of the main towns in Galilee, there's a mob going by. And we see this in other Gospels. We see when Jesus was 12 years old in the Gospel of Luke, there are such big extended families going that they didn't even realize that 12-year-old Jesus wasn't with them. There's such a mob, they assumed he was with one of the extended family and had to go back to Jerusalem and so on, because these pilgrimages were massive to Jerusalem. And people were living in tents down there, and so there's just mobs going through. We see when Jesus, elsewhere in John, when he was going on to the Passover from Galilee, that numerous people, including all of his family, were going. So the answer to why coming and going, it doesn't say in Mark or Matthew or Luke. But in John, you get this little detail that would explain it. Now, when you move on to the feeding of the 5,000 itself, several of the Gospels say people sat down on the grass. That doesn't sound that unusual, but actually we'll see later that that's not always the case. But in Mark, for some reason, Mark says the grass is green. Now, that doesn't really jump out at you when you're reading the story, but it's the kind of detail that an eyewitness comes up with. Have you ever had somebody tell you a story where they say, I was driving down this street, and on the other side, this ambulance was coming with its lights on or whatever, and you're thinking, oh, this is going to be important. There's going to be something to do with this ambulance. And they get to the end of the story, and you realize the ambulance had nothing to do with the story. But it was a visual thing, and that's something people remember. People don't always trim everything down to the bare necessities when they're retelling a story. They have details that are just stuck in their mind because they saw it. And it's not always, important. But is the grass always green up in Galilee? Well, no, actually it's not. In Galilee, and actually it's funny that a very skeptical liberal scholar was one of the first to investigate this a century ago. The grass is only green and thick right after the early spring rains in Galilee. And afterwards, it gets grazed down by animals, and it also gets turned brown in the summer. So there's actually only a short time in which the grass is green and you would sit down on it. What time is that? After the early spring rains. Well, once again, John alone says this miracle took place right before the Passover. When's the Passover? Like Easter, it's spring, right? It's early spring. So it makes sense. So Peter's preaching the gospel in Rome. Mark's recording it. Peter throws in that the grass was green. Why does he throw that in? Well, just because he remembers it. Eyewitnesses do that. Something visual, they remember, they mention it. For no particular reason, it's not really essential to the story that the grass be green. That's just the way eyewitnesses tell stories. Right? Interestingly, though, if you look at, there are several accounts in the Gospels of the feeding of the 4,000. Not one of them says they sat down on the grass. Every one of them says they sat down on the ground. And so the picture you get is it's much later in the year. There's just dirt to sit on. There's just ground to sit on. And in fact, in the feeding of the 5,000, what happens after they're done? There's a whole bunch of scraps left over, and they're gathering up the scraps. And it says they gather so many baskets of scraps. And then the same thing happens in the feeding of the 4,000, except in the feeding of the 4,000, it doesn't use the same word for basket. In your English translations, it's all just basket. But the word that's used after the feeding of the 4,000 is a great big basket. Like if you were going out at harvest time and putting, cutting down grain and tossing it in, you would have this great big basket. It's the same Greek word for basket that's used in the book of Acts when Saul, before he's renamed Paul, when Saul is escaping Damascus, and they lower him over the wall at night in a basket attached to a rope. It's that kind of basket. That would be harvest time of year. Feeding of the 5,000 is more like planting time, when you only need baskets of seeds and for other routine things. So it all fits, It all fits, but nobody's designing it to fit the two different times a year. That one time a year, gigantic baskets are not being used, but you do have green grass. The other time of year, you don't have any grass, you have to sit on the ground. Great big baskets are available because it's harvest time. This is what comes out of actual eyewitness testimony. Eyewitnesses remember little details like big baskets or green grass or small baskets. It's not really the point of the story. Eyewitnesses just remember it, and so they record it. And when it all fits together across the Gospels, it's a sign that it was being reported by eyewitnesses, because that's how they talk. Now, another incident we mentioned last week, washing the disciples' feet. Last week we mentioned that you might come up with a question when you're reading John, why this particular critical moment does he suddenly wash the disciples' feet? And we pointed out that to get the explanation, you have to go to a different gospel. You go over to Luke and you find out that the disciples had been arguing among themselves who's the greatest right before this. So now it makes sense. Why would Jesus choose this moment to wash the disciples' feet? It's not explained in John 13, but you go over to Luke 22. The reason Jesus would wash their feet at this moment was because he heard them arguing about who's the greatest. Well, there's an explanation in the other direction to look at this week. When you look in Luke 22, right after Jesus rebukes them for arguing about who's the greatest, Jesus says, "For I am among you as a servant." And he's saying to them, present tense, right now I'm like a servant. Well, that would be true if he had a towel wrapped around his waist and he had been, about to wash their feet or just finished washing their feet. But once again, this is something we miss because all four Gospels are in our heads all at once. But if you read the whole Gospel of Luke, where was Jesus a servant to the disciples? Where was he conspicuously a servant? Well, he was a servant because he had just finished washing their feet, but that's not recorded in Luke 22. Luke has some details and John has some details of what happens this night. When you put it all together, it makes sense. Why would he say, "I'm among you as a servant"? Because he just got finished washing their feet. Why did he wash their feet right at that moment? Because they were disputing among themselves over who was the greatest, which is a detail not found in John 13. So only by piecing them together do you have a story that makes total sense. And once again, that's what comes from eyewitnesses recording different details. You piece together eyewitnesses, you get a coherent story from start to finish where you don't really have any unresolved questions anymore. Now, when Jesus is being put on trial, he goes before the Sanhedrin and then he goes before Pilate. Right? And when he's before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, we find in the Synoptic Gospels that there's an accusation that sounds like somebody has some sort of garbled remembrance of something Jesus said, but they're not getting it right. The version in Matthew says, "Finally, two who came forward stated, 'This man said, I can demolish God's sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Well, that's not exactly what Jesus said, but they have some, partially accurate, partially inaccurate memory of something that Jesus really did say, right? But where did Jesus say it? Not in Matthew or Mark or Luke. Only in John does it make sense. Why would they say such a thing? Well, because early at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John chapter 2, 3 years before this, and those 3 years helped the memory get garbled. When John records that Jesus, after cleansing the temple, said, "Destroy this sanctuary, and I will raise it up in 3 days." And John records that no one understood, even the disciples who were present, no one understood what he was talking about until later, until the resurrection. Only after the resurrection did disciples understand lots and lots of things, right? Then it suddenly became clear to them. Oh, Jesus was talking about his body, the temple of his spirit. He wasn't talking about Herod's temple. He wasn't talking about how he could rebuild Herod's temple in 3 days. He was saying, you're going to destroy this body, but I can raise it up after 3 days. That made no sense to the people who were listening. 3 years later, we have this garbled version of it being thrown at Jesus as an accusation. If you piece together the false accusation in Matthew and Mark and the 3 years earlier incident in John, you get a coherent picture. But none of these gospel authors are trying to cooperate to make it coherent. This is a totally different story 3 years earlier from John. He's not trying to explain something in Matthew or Mark. He's just telling the story of Jesus cleansing the temple at the beginning of his ministry. He doesn't have any design to make this false accusation understandable. He's just saying, here's what happened. That's the kind of thing you get from eyewitnesses. Now, after the Sanhedrin is finished with him, they decide that's blasphemy. You've heard it now, that's blasphemy. Then they take him before Pilate. Pilate, however, is not going to execute somebody for blasphemy. Pilate doesn't care about the Jews having religious disputes among themselves. So his accusers from among the Jews need to come up with something besides that, don't they? If they want to get the Roman authorities to execute Jesus, claiming blasphemy isn't going to do it. So how can they make the Roman authorities worried about Jesus? They can say, well, this man's claiming to be the king of the Jews. He's claiming he's a rival to Caesar. He's claiming you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar and so on. The false accusations all shift when they go before the Roman authorities. They shift to things that Roman authorities would be worried about. But once again, if we look at just the details recorded in Luke, it's interesting. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said it." I mentioned last week, that's an idiom. We have a similar idiom in English today. You said it, meaning it's true, but it's not just me saying it, it's you saying it too, you know. So Jesus is basically saying, yes, are you the king of the Jews? Yes, I am. You've said the truth. Now, stop right there. Shouldn't that worry Pilate? As a Roman authority, one of his big concerns is somebody's going to lead a rebellion. And that's what the Jews want to pin on Jesus. You got to worry about this man. He's claiming to be a king. He's claiming to be a rival to Caesar. So Pilate should be very, very worried when Jesus says, yeah, you said it, I'm king of the Jews. And instead, what's Pilate's reaction? Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, I find no grounds for charging this man. Now, does that make any sense as a reaction from Pilate? Why is he not worried? Well, we have a more detailed account of the conversation in the book of John. And in the book of John, before Pilate goes out and tells the crowds, I find no grounds for charging this man, here's some additional conversation. My kingdom is not of this world, said Jesus. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom doesn't come from here. And then Pilate goes out and tells the crowd, I find no reason to charge this man. Now it makes sense. Pilate has been reassured, my followers are not going to fight because that's not the kind of kingdom I have. So when you piece together Luke and John, okay, Luke didn't have all the details that we have in John. And because he doesn't have all the details, it doesn't really make sense. Are you the king of the Jews? Yeah, I am. Okay, I'm not worried about you. That's how it comes across in Luke. That leaves us hanging, why would he react that way? So that's the opposite of what I would expect from a Roman governor. Because he reacted that way because it had already been made clear to him. Not that kind of king. My followers aren't going to take up the sword against you. They're not going to fight on my behalf. I don't have a kingdom of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. At which point, Pilate says, oh, so this is a religious dispute among Jews. Not my problem. Who cares? As a Roman authority, I don't settle religious disputes among Jews and don't really care to hear about them. So now it makes sense, but only when you piece together the multiple eyewitness accounts. Thank you for your time and attention.